G'day guys, this episode on Pickels Pickles, we're turning up the heat and making our own fermented hot sauce. Now hot sauce is a great way to add some flavour and a spicy kick to your food, and you might be surprised to learn that some of your favourite hot sauces like Tabasco and Sriracha are actually fermented. When you ferment chilies, it does a lot to develop the flavour, and it also helps to mellow out the heat a little bit to give you a nice well-rounded sauce. Now there are limitless ways to make hot sauce, which is great, but it's also a bit intimidating if you don't know where to start. So I'm going to show you a recipe that I've used before that ended up with a delicious hot sauce with just the right amount of spice. Now the first thing you need to do is to figure out which chilies are going to go into your sauce. So I'm going to start with 250 grams of red habaneros, which is quite a hot chili, and it's really going to be what brings the heat to our sauce. Then I'm going to cut it with 400 grams of standard red chilies and about 100 grams of Rio teardrop chilies. Now that's going to help balance out the heat profile so it's not too spicy, and the Rio teardrops are going to add a really nice colour to the sauce. And feel free to customise the ratio of chilies to your taste. If you want a milder sauce, you can just use a few habaneros, but if you really want it to pack a punch, make sure you load up on those habaneros, remembering that the fermentation process is going to reduce the spice level over time. I'll also add 250 grams of red capsicum, which will just help to balance out the spice and acidity with a little bit of sweetness, which is a nice touch that really comes through in the final product. I'll also add a small onion sliced and a few cloves of garlic just for a bit more depth of flavour. And here's where you can really get creative with your ingredients. The beauty of making your own sauce is that you can add stuff that you like. Anything goes really, just think of things that might enhance the flavour of your sauce. I like to add a few peppercorns and about 4 or 5 pods of cardamom. Now to prepare your chilies, I strongly urge you to learn from my mistakes and wear some gloves. I mean, the gochujang is really good. Oh, gloves before you add the gochujang. Come on. When you're only chopping up a couple of chilies, it's no big deal, but when you're working with heaps of them, especially the habaneros, you don't realise how much of the oils from the chilies get on your hands and how hard it can be to get rid of them. So if you don't want your hands and anything they touch to be burning for the whole day or even longer, please use gloves. Don't say I didn't warn you. So you don't need to do anything special. I just chop the tops off the chilies, cut them in half, and get rid of the seeds. Then I'll just roughly chop the capsicum into large pieces and pop in the rest of our ingredients. Then we've got all our ingredients in the one bowl. So I like to ferment my chilies in these chunks, so I'll just go ahead and pop everything into a big glass jar. Now some people like to blend their chilies into a paste before they ferment it, but I've had good results using whole chilies, so I'll just keep doing what works. Next we'll need to add a brine to submerge our chilies. Now if you've watched my other fermentation videos, you'll know that fermentation is an anaerobic process, and that means without oxygen. So we're going to have to keep our chilies submerged underneath the brine so they can ferment the way we want them to. And as always, I'm going to use one of my plastic fermentation buddies to help keep everything submerged. Now everyone's jar is different and can accommodate different levels of brine, so I like to make about 1 litre of brine first and then add it as needed, making sure I put the chilies in first so it doesn't overflow. Now we're going to use a brine of about 5% salt, which works out to be about 3 tablespoons of salt or 50 grams per litre of water. And for every tablespoon of salt, I'm going to add a tablespoon of sugar to the brine as well. Now we haven't added sugar to any of our other fermentations before, but I'm adding it now because compared to cabbage and other vegetables, chilies don't have as many carbohydrates for the lactic acid bacteria to digest, so we'll just make sure that they've got enough fuel for the fermentation process. So we'll add 1 litre of water to the salt and sugar, and we'll give it a good stir to make sure we dissolve all that salt and sugar. Now once everything's dissolved and the brine's nice and clear, add it to the jar and submerge your chilies. Now all you have to do is let it ferment. Now how long you ferment it is really up to you. You can ferment it for months if you want to, as long as the fermentation's still active. Practically, it just comes down to how patient you are. With my last batch, I left it for a month, and at that point it was still really active, still bubbling away, but I just thought enough is enough, I need my sauce, and I stopped it there. So we'll put away our chilies and check on them from time to time as we leave them to ferment for about a month. So just like with other vegetables, fermenting the chilies is going to encourage the growth of lactobacillus bacteria, which is going to convert the sugars in the chilies and the brine into lactic acid. Now that lactic acid is going to give a nice tangy flavour, and it's also going to help to preserve the sauce. Another thing to keep in mind is that the fermentation process tends to mellow out the spiciness a bit, so if you leave it to ferment for ages, just remember that you might lose some of the heat. Now as always, we're going to come back every few days and check to see how the fermentation's going. So it's been fermenting for about a week now, so it's a good idea to check in and see how things are going. So right off the bat, you can tell the brine's gone this really nice orange colour, which is a good indication that the fermentation's going pretty well. And if I give it a bit of a shake, you can see all those carbon dioxide bubbles, which means the fermentation's really active. So what I like to do every week or so is take all the chilies out and give them a good squeeze. What that does is just releases some of the flavours into the brine and just helps to keep the fermentation going as well as it can. And then just give it a good squeeze. And then just return everything back into the jar. So you can see that the brine's a much more vibrant red colour now. So we'll put it back in the cupboard and check on it periodically, and then we'll come back when we've finished fermenting at about the 4-week point. Well, it's been a while, but we're finally back after a month of fermenting. And as you can see, there are still heaps of bubbles forming in the brine, so the fermentation is still really active. Now to make the sauce, all you have to do is strain out the chilies, and then blend the chilies together with some of the brine to form a nice thick liquid sauce. Now it's easiest to do it in a big blender, but I've only got a small juicing blender, so I'll just do it in a couple of batches. As for how much brine to use, for this amount of ingredients, 1 cup should be about right. Now it's best to use less liquid first and add more if you need to, because if you add too much, you can't take it back. Now if you plan on storing your sauce at room temperature, it's important to add some vinegar, which will prolong the shelf life of your sauce by increasing its acidity and making sure it doesn't grow any unwanted molds or bacteria that are going to make your sauce go bad. In that case, instead of using 1 cup of brine, I'd replace 1/3 of a cup with some white vinegar. So just to experiment, I'm going to make half of it with vinegar and half of it without. So I'll split the ingredients between the 2 cups. And then we'll add half a cup of brine to one of them. And then we'll mix some vinegar and brine together and add it to the second one. And then just blend them together. Now an important thing to mention is not to let the sauce get too hot while you're blending it. If you do, you might kill off all those microorganisms that you've worked so hard to grow. And once you've blended your sauce, check the consistency and add more liquid if you need to. Now it's time to store the sauce. Now I use these little glass bottles that I bought online that work pretty well. Otherwise you can reuse leftover bottles or just store them in bigger containers or jars. And it's much easier and less messy to use a funnel if you have one, and then just distribute the sauce between the bottles. And then you're left over with all this brine, but I actually keep this and store it in the fridge. It tastes pretty good and you can add it to curries and marinades or use it whenever you need to add a little bit of spice to something. Alright guys, so that's how you make your own fermented hot sauce. As you can see, it's got a brilliant, almost fluorescent red colour and it looks fantastic. So it's time to give it a taste and see if it was worth the wait. So this is the sauce without the vinegar that we're going to be storing in the fridge. So it's got a nice sharp bite from the habaneros, but a good amount of sweetness from the capsicum as well. I might be a little bit biased, but it's a pretty good sauce if you ask me. Now we'll try the sauce with the vinegar that we're going to store at room temperature. So the vinegar obviously adds a bit of extra acidity, which changes the flavour profile of the sauce a bit, but that's pretty good as well, to be honest. So if you've got a whole heap of chilies and a little bit of patience, you can make a fermented hot sauce just like this. And you can add it to whatever you want, and I've even given a few bottles away to friends and family, which always earns you a few points. Now of course we can't move on without giving our hot sauce a name. Now I'm going to call it the Spicy Meme Habanero Dream. So thanks for watching a very spicy episode of Pickels Pickles. Now if you enjoyed the video, feel free to give it a like and make sure you subscribe to the channel to see more videos as they come out. And I'll see you next time on Pickels Pickles.